Hello, everyone, and happy Tuesday. Welcome to today's webinar on effective fair lending with the power of data. In this webinar, the panelists will highlight challenges, risks, and concerns we are hearing from banks, financial institutions, credit unions like yours, and what to do about it. We have been having these series of webinars by Hexanica and its partners on the topic of fair lending. In our last webinar, we had almost 500 plus registrants with whom we discussed and to understand the impact on fair lending in the new Biden-Harris administration. In this session today, as apparent with the latest news, we will be focused on changes, sentiments, and perhaps some reactions within the industry as well. In this session today, we also have a white paper that we'll be referring to. And if you want a copy of that, we will also be glad to give you a copy, and please reach out to us for the same. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback on any of these topics, we would love to collaborate with you and perhaps add that to our series of webinars that is upcoming. Now, let me start introducing the first panelist. Michael or Mickey Marshall is a director of regulatory legal affairs for the Independent Community Bankers of America, which is ICBA, where he promotes ICBA's position for policymakers and advises ICBA community bankers on the regulatory and industry changes. He is a frequent speaker at industry events, including the CRA and Fair Lending Colloquium. The second panelist is Bob Brown. He is an experienced banker with 40 years industry experience in a broad array of areas within community banks and credit unions. Past 20 years, he has been a consultant to financial institutions nationwide with regard to strategy, M&A, operations, payment systems, information technology, compliance, and lending-related issues. Strong leadership skills combined with long track record of innovation is what he has. He is also a co-author of Check 21 and is a strategic advisor to Tweezer. Our third panelist, Arun Iyer. Arun is currently Chief Product Officer at Hexanica. Arun is a business and IT leader with 22 years plus experience with banking and financial services industry in the area of product management, operating model, business architecture, process optimization, and information management. Arun has a keen interest in building innovative solutions, and at Hexanica is responsible for product strategy roadmap, while also enabling the business and sales function. Our last moderator or person to introduce is Justin Mussolino. He is the CEO and founder at Tweezer. He is experienced compliance training professional with over 20 years of creating, developing compliance training programs, managing regulatory projects, liaising with regulators, and identifying gaps and opportunities for improvement in risk mitigation. Without any further delay, Justin will moderate the event, and let me hand over the session to him. Thank you, Justin, and please take over.
Thank you very much, Yogesh. I couldn't have done a better introduction myself. Bob, Mickey, Arun, it's great to have you guys here. Great to have you aboard, and let's get rolling. So fair lending is a topic once again, but let's start with a little foundation for everybody. So I'm going to throw this out to the three of you gentlemen. So fair lending. So what regulations make up the umbrella under fair lending?
Sure. So Justin, the two core regulations of fair lending are the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or ECOA. Under both of those laws, there are basically two theories of how you violate them. They are disparate treatment or disparate impact. Disparate treatment deals with intentional discrimination, whereas disparate impact can be unintentional discrimination. So because today's presentation has a focus on the importance of data in fair lending compliance, we're going to be focusing mostly on disparate impact, that second theory. Now, there's been some controversy surrounding disparate impact, whether it even should be legally cognizable. So currently we're operating under the Supreme Court's theory in inclusive communities, which says that disparate impact is legally cognizable under the Fair Housing Act. And the way that disparate impact is defined is basically that a policy that has a discriminatory effect on a protected class is unlawful if it doesn't serve a substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interest, or if a less discriminatory alternative could also serve that interest. And so the operative component of that is the discriminatory effect part. And that's why it's important to sort of have good understanding of your bank or credit union's data in order to understand whether or not your lending and underwriting policies are creating that discriminatory effect. And just real quickly, that broadens out then into some other regulations like the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which collects mortgage loan data and can be used to show that discriminatory effect. And then coming down the pike is Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which is sort of like a HMDA for small business lending, which will provide sort of more data into small business lending and may create sort of another risk vector for fair lending violations. And then lastly, of course, you have the Community Reinvestment Act, where your fair lending performance is evaluated as a part of your CRA exam. So there's, as you can see, sort of an expansive suite of regulations that fair lending implicates.
Bob, you want to add any insight? I don't know if you could top Mickey on this one. Let's see.
Thank you, Justin. I largely agree with Mickey. I think you need to approach this broadly and then drill down to specific products and services with nuanced requirements for each. Not all requirements apply equally in every case. In some ways, the definition of fair lending is in the eye of the beholder. For example, the Federal Finance Housing Agency, which regulates Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, recently stated that with regard to fair lending, they consider the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or COA, the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Housing Enterprises Financial Safety and Soundness Act, or the Safety and Soundness Act, as the fair lending laws, ignoring the Dodd-Frank 1071 requirements. This is human nature to reduce the scope of things based upon your perspective and your self-interest. Justin?
All right, gentlemen, that was excellent. Great way to kick off the session. I'm actually having tears running down my cheek. So before we get any further, I want to let everybody know, if you have any questions throughout, please enter them into the question tab. So we'll try to address them during the course of the programming, and if not, we'll get them at the end. So feel free to enter any questions that you may have. All right, so this question is for everybody. So what are the greatest regulatory challenges that we have in fair lending right now? Who wants to kick that off?
I'll take it. This is Bob. I think that the biggest challenge in fair lending is that politics is now becoming a significant factor in these discussions, with the playing field constantly being adjusted by those with the loudest megaphone. Executive orders by both parties can instantly change the focus of fair lending without any of the checks and balances built into our legislative systems by our nation's founders. Implementation timing, normally built into real legislation, can be bypassed as politicians seek to implement political agendas. An ineffective Congress encourages the use of non-legislative solutions to achieve political objectives. However, these changes can be immediately reversed by the stroke of a pen when the occupant of the White House changes. Financial institutions cannot always change that quickly, considering the investments in technologies, people, and procedures that must be changed. Financial institutions must begin to think in terms of weeks and months for system introductions versus their old standards of quarters and years. When programs take years to progress through the regulatory process that are in place in Washington, D.C., it is difficult to filter out the noise and focus on specific requirements as they emerge. We have recently seen very rapid implementation timeline for programs like the SBA's Paycheck Protection Program and the upcoming CFPB avoidable mortgage forbearance programs, where financial institutions are giving days and weeks to implement significant new programs. It is also difficult for individual financial institutions to experiment with new and innovative ideas when they fear that same innovation can run them afoul of specific compliance requirements that may have been developed years ago before specific social changes occurred. I think a second challenge is that the financial institution employees were classified as essential workers during the pandemic, and they're still emerging from the cloud associated with those temporary procedures. In recent weeks, I've talked to several bank executives, and most of them are still thinking in terms of very short-term objectives, like getting employees back in the office, and are not yet thinking in strategic terms with programs that will be implemented in the next 2 years, like the 1071 program. Justin?
Great. Mickey, Arun, want to add
Yeah.
to that? Okay,
Yeah,
Arun.
so this is Arun here. Thanks, Justin. I'll add to that. So, as Mickey mentioned, one of the biggest risks really for financial institutions is being blindsided by by getting into a disparate impact kind of a situation, right? Take, for example, the current pandemic situation. A lot of financial institutions have been forced to take business decisions, and this could have a disparate impact on certain customer segments that they are servicing, right? So banks need to be aware of this. So the biggest challenge really is to look at various facets of fair lending holistically, right? And it could be just the data collection and submission across the various regulations that are there, being continuously monitoring your various fair lending metrics, be it around redlining, steering, marketing, underwriting, and so forth. Looking at aspects such as your customer experience throughout the lending process, or governance around your underwriting models, which might be using alternative data. All these aspects need to be looked holistically, and some kind of a fair lending program and getting it all together is the biggest challenge at financial institutions.
Yeah, and I would just add in and basically say I agree with what the previous two panelists have said, but really to give some more color to Bob's point about, one of the most difficult things is there's sort of a whipsaw effect between administrations as regulations tend to change back and forth. And I think we've seen this really in housing and urban developments, discriminatory effects or disparate impact rule. And we've also seen it in the Community Reinvestment Act. And again, there's always a lot of sort of regulatory balls in the air at any given time, and it's difficult for, I think, a lot of financial institutions to keep track of, separate the signal from the noise, if you will. So with the HUD disparate impact rule, we had first an Obama administration rule in 2013, then we had the Supreme Court's Inclusive Communities decision, then we had a new rule in 2020, and now earlier this month, you've had HUD go back and say, no, in fact, we're going to the 2013 rule again. And similar with CRA, you had OCC go out on its own, finalize a rule in 2020, and now this administration say, well, we're going to walk that rule back. So I think that's sort of the biggest fair lending compliance challenge, is figuring out, okay, what set of rules am I being evaluated under, and for how long is that set of rules going to apply? So that's the difficult thing, I think, is keeping abreast of the changes.
All right, great. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And with that being said, the conclusion of that question, we're going to go to our first poll question of the day, which should be launching momentarily. So what are the biggest challenges to implement a more effective data analytics program for fair lending? And yes, this is a multiple choice test. Poll, sorry. Okay, we'll give everybody 30 seconds to answer, and then we'll post the results. All right, Swaroop, do we have the results from the poll question? All right, thank you very much. So it looks like performing risk assessments and other research to determine the gaps and opportunities was the number one at 70%, followed by understanding the regulatory guidance. All right, great. This is good insight. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to answer. So with that out of the way, we're going to go into the next point, and we're going to talk more about upcoming challenges, but really specifically from an operational and data standpoint. So Mickey, Bob, either one, gentlemen, if we want to go first on this topic.
Well, I can start, and I just want to address, I saw a question in the Q&A about Section 1071 and asking us to go into more detail about that. So I definitely see that as one of the big upcoming challenges. As we know, Dodd-Frank was passed, over a decade ago now, and this has been one of sort of the last pieces of the Dodd-Frank Act to be finalized. So I think it was hard to keep all the dates straight, but sometime last year, ICBA actually participated along with some of our member banks in the CFPB's SBREFA panel, their small business panel, where they collected the feedback from small institutions. But basically, just to give you a high level summary of what Section 1071 is it's a requirement in the Dodd-Frank Act to collect certain racial and demographic data from small business applicants. Now it's a little bit, again, there's more complexity to it than that, but it's this idea of the Congress felt that there was a lack of transparency into bank and other financial institution lending to small businesses, and whether they're reaching minority-owned businesses, whether they're reaching women-owned businesses. And so Section 1071 is, a way to sort of collect that data so that they can evaluate and see, which financial institutions are perhaps underperforming in small business lending to minority-owned small businesses. There are a lot of challenges sort of with the rollout of that. Hopefully when the notice of proposed rulemaking comes out later this September, we'll get some clearer insight into, if there are exemptions, what the thresholds for those exemptions are, whether this is going to apply to agriculture lending or farm loans, as well as small business loans. So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions around Section 1071, but it is going to be sort of another data collection requirement for a lot of financial institutions that they're going to have to face. So I foresee that as sort of a big upcoming operational challenge.
Great. Thank you, Mickey. And thank you, Ken, for submitting the question. Any other questions come along the way, please submit them. All right, going back to the topic. Bob, did you want to chime in on Mickey's response or anything addition?
Yeah, following that theme of 1071, to address the challenges of implementing fair lending from a business banking and compliance approach, financial institution managements need clear guidance, including specific timelines to address the requirements. We also need a sense of urgency with a specific understanding of how non-compliance findings could affect the financial institution in terms of things like the impact on merger and acquisition initiatives. It'll be very helpful if operationally, data could be collected using modified procedures that allow for the capture of data following procedures similar to existing processes. All too often, regulatory agencies and compliance personnel insist on new procedures requiring new forms and new systems to collect and capture data whenever a new requirement is introduced. One of the objections expressed by the various groups that we are seeking to assist under fair lending is the complexity of the paperwork associated with the process. Simplification of the process while collecting additional data should be an objective of the regulatory agencies. Last week, I closed on a home and was inundated with a pile of redundant and superfluous paper just to close on a simple transaction. Decades of regulatory requirements piling up onto requirements to complete this process has unnecessarily burdened the system with duplicative and therefore unnecessary documentation and collection efforts. All too often, financial institutions throw manual paper-based systems at these activities instead of investing in more modern technology techniques to improve the compliance and employee productivity. One of the specific items we agreed to discuss was alternative data and emerging underwriting techniques that are difficult until regulated financial institutions are given the freedom to experiment with new data sources and formulas. They will not be able to truly innovate in these areas. Fintechs free of much of this oversight currently don't feel the full impact of similar restrictions. the best solution will be for the regulatory agencies to organize an annual survey of the industry regarding new alternative data sources and algorithms, and then summarize those in an annual report to Congress for consideration. Congress could then evaluate these methods and authorize the regulatory agencies to proceed with an organized implementation approach, which include appropriate protections for financial institutions as they implement and collect data. Justin?
Great. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Mickey. Very thorough. So let's get into a little bit more about potential consequences of non-compliance, and particularly, like, what is the role of data and operational challenges that are supposed to be observed? Mickey, Bob, who wants to address this first?
I've got it. So there are always fears of fines or formal or informal agreements being issued, and even a stern letter from the appropriate agency. But other restrictions that could be imposed are probably more concerning. Delays in approving an M&A transaction while agencies ponder whether or not they feel that a financial institution is appropriately addressing their fair lending responsibilities can be very impactful. It is not always the specifics of the individual regulatory requirements, but also the informal, subjective enforcement of these activities that can cost financial institutions significantly in terms of time, dollars, and opportunities. Justin?
Thank you very much, Bob. Mickey?
Yeah, I would just add, I think there's a lot of reputational risk associated with fair lending as well, even when it's, just the idea of an allegation of a fair lending violation itself can really harm a financial institution's reputation, with customers. So I think, that's why what we see a lot of is there's pressure to settle these cases out of court rather than to litigate them, even if, the bank feels, hey, look, we've done nothing wrong. Just the mere specter of sort of allegations of fair lending violations, that can have a really chilling effect on your customers' opinions. So I think that's sort of a big risk of non-compliance, is you put yourself in a position where you're really risking the reputation of your financial institution.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. So just for the audience, if you want to submit any other questions, please feel free. But now we're going to get to our second poll question, which will be displayed in 2 moments. All right. How automated are the current data processes for fair lending compliance? Give everybody about 15 seconds to answer. And then we will display the results. Okay, I think we can close the poll. There we go. So somewhat automated and then highly manual. Great. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to answer. That is very interesting. All right, so moving on, we're going to go into a little bit more data governance. So Arun, Bob, what are the data governance considerations around fair lending? Who would like to start?
Yep. So this is Arun here. I'll take that Justin first. Data governance is as important today as it was, say, 5 years back, right? And especially when it comes to fair lending compliance officers are sort of data stewards for fair lending data, right? And this starts from everything, sourcing the data, making sure that the quality of data that is submitted to the regulator is accurate, documenting all the transformations, being able to show auditability and data lineage. All of that is part and parcel of what bank needs to take care of when it comes to data governance around your fair lending data. Another interesting aspect which has now emerged, especially, and Bob mentioned about the use of alternative data, is this whole facet around model governance and governance around alternative data. So if you are using alternative data directly in your models, or even outsourcing models from a third party, you need to be able to track and document, right, where this data is coming from, have an approach to ensure that the coverage of this data is adequate. Which segment are you covering this data for? Is it for all your customers? Is it for a particular class of customers? Quality, completeness, consistency, accuracy, reliability, all these aspects of data governance have to be put into perspective when it comes to alternative data. Then the entire documentation of the model itself, right? How is this data going into the model, and what are the outcomes that it is generating, especially if alternative data is used to take credit decisions. There needs to be documentation around that, testing and validation of the results. And of course, this brings to the topic of privacy, right? Because you're really using customer data, which could be customer demographics, their cash flows, and other bank information. So how do you ensure data privacy around use of this data in your models? So these are a couple of aspects of data governance that is very, very important for banks.
Yeah, just data security has long been a standing issue for our industry. Nearly 40 years ago, I was testing a new data communications program for a money transfer operation, and we need to seek out why things weren't properly being processed on our end. We put a scope on the line and realized that the communications vendor, in an interest to save money for circuits, had placed the 3 largest banks in our market on the same multi-drop circuit, and we're transmitting the data in the clear for anyone with the right technology to capture and read. No one in any of the 3 affected banks admitting to knowing that this was happening. I think that it's imperative that data security cannot be overstated. I'm most concerned about security of our customers' data if it gets released either accidentally or intentionally by government agencies with no real liability for the consequences of their failure to protect customer data. My personal data has been breached at least twice by federal governmental agencies, and it cost us a great deal of time to identify and correct some of the identity theft issues associated with those breaches. Justin?
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Arun. So Bob, Arun, I'm going to stick with you guys in the next question. So what are the other proactive mechanisms available given the potential higher scrutiny, changes, and challenges out in the environment?
Right.
Would like
yeah, I'll take that, Justin, first. To Bob. Especially since banks are at different level of maturity when it comes to their fair lending sort of processes, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. However, if you see, fair lending is a highly data-driven regulation, right? So making data the front and center of your fair lending program would be the first step, right? And this has to be done in a progressive manner. As I said, firms are at different level of maturity, and we have you can look at a 3-stage approach: comply, assess, and prevent, right? So start with every bank has to comply. So making sure that your data processes around sourcing data, transforming it, ensuring data quality, performing the edit checks, and then submitting the data. All banks do it, and as we saw in the poll recently, it's either highly manual or semi-automated. So trying to automate that, and today it is possible to automate this entire process. Once you automate it, this process becomes repeatable. So if you are now looking at a 1071 and new attributes to be submitted, you could piggyback on your existing data processes to ensure that you can onboard this regulation much faster. Once you have the data in place, you can build layers of analysis or analytics on top of that, right? So be it continuously monitoring your risk metrics around denial rates, redlining, pricing. This shouldn't be something that is done once in a year or when an examiner is coming to examine you. Banks need to build it as part of their monthly processes, monthly reporting, so that they are on top of what the possibilities of disparate impact. Benchmarking with your industry peers, statistical analytics, trends and ad hoc reports, all of these are part of what you could do to assess your fair lending risks on a reactive basis. And once you've addressed both these aspects, you move to graduate to the third phase, which is more preventive risk management, where you could use, again, machine learning, artificial intelligence, historical data that is published by the regulators to build models to validate your own actions taken. You could incorporate customer feedback, customer complaints into your fair lending processes to make sure that you are addressing them proactively right upfront rather than as a post facto analysis. Right. So this three-stage approach can be adopted so that over a period of time, banks have a more comprehensive fair lending approach, keeping data as the center of it. Back to you, Justin.
Okay, thank you very much. Bob, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that financial institutions need to really focus on trying to simplify their IT architectures. That includes reducing the number of systems and the number of databases that they're supporting, and also reducing the number of languages that used by the various vendors. The second thing I would do is look at building improved interfaces to the various systems to reduce the rehandling of data and reduce the time it takes to process transactions. At my old bank, we used to have a rule that if we were going to introduce a new system, we had to kill 2 systems in the process. And that was a pretty good rule of thumb for trying to simplify your systems. Back to you, Justin.
And Justin, if I may just follow up on what Bob mentioned about consolidation, right? So when we look at these multi-step process, it may seem like it is a very expensive investment from a technology perspective, but actually it is not, right? Today, with the availability of cloud, open source technologies, and open source AI machine learning, it's very cost effective to build a complete data platform around fair lending, right? And it's not that all of this needs to be done in one go, right? It is typically a phased approach, and you could build these layers as I talked about, and the pay-per-use model is available with a lot of vendors out there, right? So in my experience, firms could actually reduce costs of technology and data processes by 40 to 50% by adopting this phased approach.
Great, thank you, Bob. The investment that you put in, you have to look down the road on what the economic benefits you're going to get out. It might be a decent size investment initially, but the efficiency and the cost savings that have to be considered from a longer term perspective. But thank you, gentlemen, that was great. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go to the third and final poll, which should be launched in one moment. Okay, here it comes. So what would you like to hear next as far as our next webinar in our series? AI, data and ops, or changing regulations? Yeah, please vote. We absolutely appreciate it. All right, give everybody 15 seconds. I do feel like a game show host a little bit with this. Okay, we can close the poll now and display the results. All right, changing regulations received the highest marks, followed by data ops and AI. Great. Thank you, everybody, very much. Appreciate you answering the 3 poll questions. So just I guess a big point, and Mickey, I'm going to throw this out to you first. So what are your observations, being at the ICBA from an industry standpoint that you could educate the audience on?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I think the big thing to note is this administration, I think, definitely puts much more stake in fair lending enforcement than the previous administration. So I think we're going to see an increase in prevalence of enforcement actions, and this is going to be something that they're going to be sort of pursuing much more aggressively. And again, I think that's evidenced by, as I was talking about earlier, returning to the 2013 disparate impact standard as opposed to the 2020 disparate impact standard from the last administration. That 2020 standard would have had a more pleading requirements. It would have been more difficult to bring a disparate impact claim compared to this administration. I think that really sees that being proactive about this is a priority for them. And so I think from how to respond to that, I think the next thing to do then is to be proactive in return. to take steps in advance to show, this is something we are actively monitoring at our bank. So invest in, if you're using any kind of algorithm or underwriting algorithm to make loans, show that you're doing model risk assessments of that algorithm. If you're getting questions from your examiners on your CRA exam, something to consider is maybe going with a strategic plan and showing, here are the steps that we can take to show that we're reinvesting in our communities. So I think that would be the biggest thing is, if the administration is going to be more proactive about fair lending compliance, show that you are being more proactive about fair lending compliance in return, and sort of have that dialogue with your examiners, with your regulators, before something comes up. That would be, I guess, the biggest observation that I would have.
Great. Thank you very much, Mickey. Bob, Arun, anything to add?
Yeah, just an observation. The use of consistent regulatory triggers would be really helpful for the industry. Each new program or requirement should not be triggered by another metric. For example, the 1071 is triggered by 600 million in asset threshold, while most small bank activities are triggered at the 500 million fiducia threshold. I believe in keep it simple, stupid. At least within the FFIEC group of regulatory agencies, some level of consistency would be helpful.
All right, great. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, just to, I would second what Mikey said. I mean, regulatory outreach is one of things that industry should strive for. I think CFPB has been really great in inviting industry participation through their tech sprints. So that is something definitely the industry should leverage. Secondly, as I talked earlier, having a comprehensive fair lending program that covers all aspects, right? Don't just look at it in specific silos. We talked about multiple regulations under the broader fair lending bucket, but then specificities around each of those. And then the other aspects like customer experience, models, alternative data, all of that combined into one comprehensive program. And then, of course, finally, which I am a strong advocate of, is use technology that is available to reduce your cost of compliance and automate as much as possible and consolidate as much as possible.
Great. Gentlemen, now we're going to get into a little bit of Q&A. Getting some really good questions here. The first one is from Prasad. Have you considered any blockchain technology to simplify data collection, security, and governance? Yogesh, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when Exanica or some of its peers, they're building solutions, to a large extent, we focus on the business problems, and business problems typically have been around changing regulations, changing data, or lack of data availability, or sometimes more data availability. And blockchain can perhaps be used, but it has its own intricacies, whether it's operational, whether it is risk-driven. And in fact, there's another question around information sharing. And one of the negative points about blockchain technology that it is sometimes more transparent than it should be. So there are pluses and minuses of each technology. I have not seen any fair lending data provider or financial institutions that is using blockchain for fair lending. So that would be my precise answer if any other panelist would like to opine on what I just said.
Thank you, Yogesh. Arun, Bob, Mickey? All right, then we can get to our next question from Anthony. Are you seeing enforcement agencies and advocates moving towards using AI to find disparate impact?
Sure. So I can give maybe a little perspective on that. So I think the agencies, I think much like the industry itself, are sort of at the beginning phases of evaluating what artificial intelligence, what its role in the financial system is going to be. And so earlier this year, we had the agencies put out a joint request for information, or RFI, basically sort of trying to get industry feedback about how financial institutions use artificial intelligence. And so one of the big subject areas within that RFI was with regards to fair lending. And I guess specifically, artificial intelligence and as it regards to underwriting. Because again, as we talk about, disparate impact doesn't require any sort of finding of a discriminatory intent. So if you are using AI to do underwriting, that AI can still commit, you can still be held liable for disparate impact based on that. So I think that's something the agencies are concerned about, but I think they also recognize the sort of potential and promise there too. Because artificial intelligence can look at more data, the sort of alternative data, and maybe find people who a traditional underwriting method may have overlooked, and find these people who are creditworthy to extend credit to. There's this potential for expanding access to credit there. So I think the agencies are aware of that potential, but they're also aware of sort of the fair lending risk. So I think this is where you've seen CFPB kind of take an interesting approach to this, which is looking at certain companies' model risk assessment plans. If companies can show they're being proactive in monitoring the fair lending risk presented by their underwriting, then they can issue a no action letter that basically says, as long as you're complying with this risk assessment plan, we're not going to take an administrative action against you if you're taking steps to redress any fair lending violations you might see. So I think that's one good approach to realize the potential benefits of AI. I guess more specifically, though, to answer this question, whether the agencies themselves are using it to monitor, I don't think so yet. I think there are conversations about looking at AI to monitor sort of systemic risk within the financial system. So that may be something to look for down the road, agencies using AI as sort of a compliance monitoring. But I don't think we're at that stage yet.
And just a couple of things. So the last quarter, or the last 2 quarters, there were 2 tech sprints by CFPB. The first one was around adverse action notices, right? Again, it comes back to how the underwriting models use artificial intelligence, and how do you explain to the end customer on an adverse action that has been taken, and the reason, right? What was the reason for it? And CFPB was seeking inputs around that. And the second one was around the use of their historical data that CFPB publishes every year, right? It's a delayed publication of all the HMDA data that is submitted, and how that data can be used by the industry participants to generate more analytics, right? And some of the ideas were around using machine learning and alternate artificial intelligence to use this data around taking some of these decisions around action taken, disparate impact. And while it's all at the end, it's all about whatever models that you're building, are you able to build a proper governance? Are you able to ensure that there aren't any algorithmic biases? I think that the regulator is open to use of artificial intelligence, but with certain boundaries defined around how the data should be used, and how do you ensure that you are not introducing any biases. So back to you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and Justin, I would also like to add something is, one aspect is with limited set of data that was available in the past, the rules-based system was able to manage that. But now the regulators, including, by the way, Census Bureau and others, are providing more information. And it is simply impossible to use traditional technology or human-based technologies where you need manual power to deal with all this data. So it is not directly as a requirement to use artificial intelligence, but as more and more data is getting available, use of artificial intelligence is going to be more apparent. Statistical modeling was always used for fair lending, but now essentially it is going to the next level. And as Miki and Arun said, that regulators are already seeking information. Perhaps they are also working with within themselves as well as with fintech companies to do some testing. So there are clear indications that artificial intelligence perhaps will be used by the regulators and also expected by the financial institutions to use it. And more importantly, as Arun explained, once the use starts, the transparency, governance, and all that will come along with use of artificial intelligence. So we have to be perhaps aware of this and start taking steps in that direction.
Okay, great, guys. Thank you very much. Okay, we have one other question from Prasad. Explainability is critical for compliance. Can you throw some light on challenges you faced? Mickey, you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. So I think right now the agency's approach regarding explainability is basically to use their current regulations. And so I think one of the ways they do that is, a disclosure of, here are the factors I looked at when I was making my underwriting decision can be sufficient to satisfy the sort of Reg B requirements for adverse action notices. So I think in a similar vein, if you can disclose, here are the, the inputs that my algorithm looked at, it doesn't have to be necessarily, you don't have to give, well, and I assigned X percentage of, the importance to this factor or Y percentage to that factor. So that's how you can sort of, get through or answer explainability without sort of disclosing the, secret sauce or even, some of the black box problem of AI. Which is, if you have a dynamically updating model, it can be difficult even to know, how it made any given decision. But a disclosure of the factors, can be sort of sufficient for purpose of meeting your regulatory requirements. I think that's the current approach. That may change if it proves that approach doesn't work, but I think that's a fair assessment of the current approach.
Great. Thank you very much, Mickey. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have. Before we wrap up, panelists, do you have any closing commentaries you wish to add?
Perhaps I can start and others can join, Justin. Actually, I do see some more questions popping up, but in the interest of time, perhaps we can reach out to the audience later. There are questions around overall transparency of data. There are questions around privacy of data. There are questions around specific attribute on data around English proficiency and others. And all that can be answered. And we are always available to speak to all of you if you have any specific questions around regulation, data, or technology. But by and large, I think this was our second webinar. First was around changing regulation. And perhaps in a couple of months, we will have a touch point as we get more clarity around the changing landscape of regulation. Today, the focus was more on data and operations. And there were questions today on explainability or transparency or artificial intelligence, which will be the topic of our next session. So would like to encourage all the participants to send questions or the topics of interest. We got some topic of interest already, so we'll touch upon that. But a great session, and would love the audience to actually reach out. We also have a white paper on all these topics, and the recording will be available. So all of the panelists and participants or registrants can reach out for more information.
Okay, great. Thank you, Yogesh. All right, panelists, thank you very much for the time today. And thank you for everybody attending. It was an absolute pleasure. Everybody have a good day.
Thank you.